All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar for the 2024 Spring Hydrologic Outlook webinar series for the Greater Mississippi River Basin. I'm Joseph Volko. I'm one of the hydrologists here at the National Water Center. I'll be giving a general overview of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi, Souris River, Red River for the north, and Great Lakes basins. We will also hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for some more detailed information on flood potential across those regions. Just as a heads up, this webinar is being recorded. We will send a follow-up email with key messages, information, a link to the story map, and a PDF copy of the information covered in this webinar. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box, and we'll address it at the conclusion of the presentations. So the key message for today is that the potential for spring flooding impacts across the greater Mississippi River Basin is normal to below normal this year. So now we'll kind of jump into some of the antecedent conditions forecast information and give a little bit more detail as to what's leading to this normal to below normal spring flooding potential. So we'll start with the past 90 days accumulated precipitation percent of mean. You can see in the blue shadings there that there's been above normal precipitation across portions of the Missouri Basin and the Arkansas Red Basin over the past 90 days, but remember, this does not necessarily mean that there's an increased flood threat across those regions, and this will be covered a little bit more later on. And then elsewhere across the greater Mississippi River Basin, normal to below normal precipitation has been observed since about mid-November of 2023. And so the main takeaway here is that there hasn't really been a widespread significant precipitation over the past 3 months that will significantly impact the spring flood outlook this year. We can look and see how the rainfall over the past 3 months has impacted the current soil moisture conditions. And here we're looking at the Climate Prediction Center's soil moisture ranking percentiles. And what we're seeing is that the current soil moisture conditions reflect that precipitation over the past 3 months across portions of the Arkansas Red Basin and Missouri Basin, where we are seeing those green shadings indicating the soil moisture rankings above the 70th percentile. And then elsewhere across the Ohio River Basin, upper Midwest, and northern plains, soil moisture ranking percentiles are generally less than the 30th percentile, which is just speaking to the longer term dry conditions across those regions. And then across portions of the lower Mississippi River Basin, there have been some moistening of the soils recently from some rainfall events over the past couple of weeks, which is starting to show up in the soil moisture data shown here as well. Now moving on to stream flows across the Mississippi Basin, we're looking at the USGS stream flows compared to historical stream flow for all days of the year. And what we're seeing is that the stream flows are a bit elevated in the lower Arkansas Red and lower Mississippi River Basins in response to that rainfall over the past couple of weeks, but really nothing out of the ordinary here. And then elsewhere across the Mississippi Basin, flows are generally normal to below normal. And note that in the northern plains, a lot of those gauges are turned off in the winter as they get iced in, so that's reflected in those white and blank areas you see there. Now taking a look at the longer term drought conditions, the drought conditions have improved across portions of the Arkansas Red Basin and Missouri Basin in comparison to where we were at this time last year, but areas of moderate to extreme drought still persist across portions of the Central Plains and into the upper Midwest and Northern Plains. And then down across Louisiana and Mississippi, there is more drought in place in comparison to where we were at this time last year. But remember that this region has been moistening up recently, so a lot of variables to consider here when it comes to the overall flood potential. So we'll switch gears a little bit and look at the past 3 months average temperature departures from mean. And anomalously warm temperatures have been seen across much of the basin, especially in the upper Midwest and northern plains, which has led to a very minimal river ice development and a decreased risk for ice jam flooding across the basin this year, as well as in the normally low snowpack across the Ohio River Basin, upper Midwest, northern plains, and the upper Missouri Basin, which decreases the total runoff available for flooding this spring. And now we can visually look at the current snow water equivalent across the basin that's in place as we speak. And it's pretty easy to see that there's minimal snow water equivalent in place across the entire Mississippi Basin, with the only notable SWE in the terrain of the Intermountain West, and then some fresh snowfall for the past 24 hours from South Dakota through southern Minnesota and Wisconsin there. There will be some additional snow across the mid to upper Mississippi Basin through this Saturday as well, but should really only result in around a half an inch of snow water equivalent. And then looking out over the next week at precipitation totals, there is not really any hydrologically significant precipitation expected over the next 7 days, but there will be some minimal additions to the snowpack and new snowpack development through day 3, which is Saturday, across the northern and central plains, and then into potentially into portions of the Ohio River Basin as well. And now looking further out into the forecast period and focusing on week 2, during that last week of February, we'll take a look at the Climate Prediction Center's 8 to 14-day precipitation outlook, where we're not really seeing a strong signal for any significant precipitation across the entire basin. And for that same time period, the CPC forecast probabilities do lean toward above normal temperatures for the entire Mississippi Basin, which will likely maintain that limited snowpack and minimal river ice that's currently already in place. And then even further down the road for the months of March, April, and May, the CPC seasonal precipitation outlook suggests potential for above normal precipitation across lower portions of the greater Mississippi River Basin. However, there's not really a particularly strong signal for significant precipitation. And during the same time period, the CPC forecast probabilities do continue to lean toward above normal temperatures for the upper portions of the basin, suggesting a continued diminished snow and ice influence on the flood outlook this year. And we also want to hit on the forecast information from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the Great Lakes for the next 6 months. And all of the lakes besides Lake Superior are currently above their long-term average levels, but are forecast to remain well below the record high levels this spring and early summer. And now to show how all these conditions we've covered will impact the flooding forecast across the entire basin. The long-range river flood outlook shows that the potential for spring flooding across the greater Mississippi River Basin is normal to below normal this year, and minor to isolated moderate river flooding is possible across the Red River to the north, tributaries to the lower Missouri River, and the lower Mississippi River Valley. And then across the upper Midwest and northern plains, the risk for spring flooding is below normal due to a historic lack of snowpack, with any new flooding being dependent on the future precipitation events. And now I will pass it over to Jim Knoll at the Ohio Basin River Forecast Center for more information on that region.
All right, thank you, Joseph, and good afternoon, everyone. As has been already highlighted, we are expecting a normal to below normal flood risk here in the Ohio River Basin into spring. That is mainly because we don't have any ice, no real snow cover or snowpack, and so it's going to all come down to rainfall. And even as Joseph was showing, even in like week 2 or the March, April, May timeframe, even if we get periods of a little bit of above normal precipitation, it does not look like it's going to be prolonged heavy precipitation at this point. And therefore, we don't see any prolonged significant flooding here in the Ohio River Basin. And again, we don't see any major flooding of significance in the Ohio River Valley into spring. The Ohio Valley is very good at conveying water quickly through the system, usually within 7 days. So usually we need repeat events over a short time frame to cause those significant floods, and we don't see that. In addition, because of the above normal temperatures that Joseph was talking about, we expect green up conditions for our vegetation to occur earlier than normal, and that will also reduce runoff somewhat. Finally, on this note, we are thinking that because there's no ice on Lake Erie at this point, usually sometimes we get ice jam flooding into Lake Erie in northern Ohio. We don't really see that. Therefore, as you see on this map here, we still see some orange dots across the Ohio River Basin. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the rivers that we still do expect to go to minor flood stage, which would include the Little Wabash in Illinois, the Wabash Basin in Indiana and Illinois, the White River Basin in Indiana, the Maumee River Basin and the Muskingum River Basins in Ohio, the Monongahela Basin and Little Kanawha Basin in West Virginia, and the Kentucky, Cumberland, and Green River Basins in Kentucky. This is the 50% chance of exceeding those levels. If we move to the next slide, you'll see the 25% chance of what is possible given rainfall. And even here, you see only a few more orange and red dots scattered across the Ohio Valley. Again, giving the message that we don't expect major flooding this spring, and we don't expect it to be widespread or long duration. And finally, on the last slide, this is the total volume of water that moves through the Ohio Valley as predicted by our hydrologic modeling system. And the black line is the historical normal conditions in the lower Ohio Basin for the total amount of water moving through. And the blue line is what is predicted through early May for the lower Ohio Valley at Smithland. And what this shows is generally the blue line is below the black line, meaning below normal flows are forecast at least into March. And then we gradually converge towards normal for April and May, meaning again, normal to a little bit below normal flood potential as we move through spring. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sean at the North Central River Forecast Center for more on the upper Midwest.
All right, thank you, Jim. So for the North Central River Forecast area, service area here highlighted on the map, the overall flood risk, broadly speaking, is below normal this year. And for those of you who live in this part of the country, know that we've had an extremely warm winter, record-breaking in some cases. And so that fact, coupled with some areas seeing just much less snowfall below than normal, like Minnesota, for instance, or other places that have seen a lot of snow, like Iowa through southern Wisconsin and some in the Great Lakes area. We've been so warm that we've melted most of it off by this point. So at this point in mid-February, we have a historic lack of snowpack across the area. Drought conditions did ease somewhat since last fall. We had some pretty expansive moderate to extreme drought across our area, and so there has been some improvement there. I did also want to note there's a QR code that will bring you to our NCRC story map that we've issued if you want a lot more details. And while I'm on this map, I did want to highlight two areas. First, the Red River Basin there, you do see some orange and red mixed in there with the 50% chance exceedance. That area received a pretty historic rainfall event in late December, up to 3 inches of rainfall in the headwaters of the Red River Basin. And that caused an unprecedented flooding event of actual open water. Usually it's ice covered at that time of the year. So there was a minor flood event there. And so that coupled with any future precipitation is kind of why that area is a little bit sensitive right now. And then looking further south in Illinois, there's a few places lighting up due to primarily the ongoing flooding that's going on right now, but that is on the way down. And so as we look ahead to the SWE maps next, you can see that we're going to compare two very different years, last year versus this year, especially across the northern tier of our area. On the left-hand side, you can see the dark blue basins in 2023 were in the top 10% of snow water equivalent on the landscape for that time period for mid-February based on our 72-year history. So in some cases, the number one overall with the most we had seen at that time. This year, the map on the right, this is as of the 12th, a few days ago, showed basically the opposite story. A lot of red, less than 10% in the ranking, and then grayed out areas where at that time there was no snow water left in our model. So just to point that out, that really we're focused on any potential flooding in our area is pretty much dependent on future precipitation this spring. And so with that, I'll pass it to Kevin Lau. He's a service coordination hydrologist at MBRFC. Take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Sean, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll start off by saying, sort of like a broken record, that flood risk for the Missouri River Basin is also below normal in many places and near normal in some others. There are no areas within the Missouri Basin that have an above normal flood risk for this year. Soil moisture conditions have in general improved over the past year within the Missouri River Basin. Much of the basin has been in drought for the past 3 to 4 years before that. The most recent U.S. drought monitor shows 20% of the Missouri River Basin as still being classified in drought, but that compares to 63% 1 year ago. So some areas are still hurting very badly, but overall, the basin's soil moisture condition has improved. As this graphic illustrates, we are expecting minor to moderate level flooding this spring, primarily within the lower basin. And again, springtime flooding in the lower basin is typical for this time of year. It's driven primarily by thunderstorm activity. In fact, only recently, in late January, we experienced minor to moderate flooding along 4 of the tributaries in eastern Kansas and central Missouri due to a rain on snow event. So the lower basin has already seen flooding this season. Finally, the lower reach of the Missouri River itself is likely to see on again, off again, episodic minor flooding on the reach downstream of Kansas City to the mouth at St. Louis. And again, this would be due to springtime thunderstorm activity in the lower basin, and it is typical. Now, my next graphic attempts to portray these general areas highlighted in blue, where flood risk is actually below normal. These are the streams and the rivers where the chance for flooding this year is less than the historic chance for flooding over the past 30 years. Areas not highlighted, the areas in white, have a normal risk for flooding. And now I'll move to my last graphics. Mountain snowpack is critical for water resources within the Missouri River Basin. And as we look at the mountains, this left-hand graphic, and that's courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, it shows by subbasin the snow water equivalent percent of the 30-year average that we currently have in the mountainous west. Mountain snowpack can be generally categorized as being below to well below average for this time of year. By this point in the winter, we have normally accumulated just over 70% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains. So what does this average to below average mountain snowpack mean for spring mountain runoff? Well, that's what the graphic to the right attempts to display. This graphic depicts the expected April through September runoff volumes from the mountains. And our latest water supply outlook indicates a below average runoff year for the West, with the exception of the Bighorn, which could see an above average runoff year. The Bighorn has been blessed with some pretty healthy higher elevation snows in some of its subbasins. For instance, the Shoshone Basin has something like 168% of average snow water equivalent. But again, the Bighorn is an outlier in the mountainous West. As has already been said, there is a widespread but very shallow plain snowpack across eastern Montana and into western North Dakota. However, the plain snowpack thus far is not expected to play a role for the spring flood risk within the Missouri Basin. Also, a quick word about soil temperatures and frost depth. Much of the plains soils south of North Dakota have already thawed. There are some significant frost depths in extreme northern South Dakota, all the way up through North Dakota and over into Montana. And so going forward, frozen ground could increase the runoff potential in those areas. And also a word about ice jam breakup flood potential. Ice has moved out or is rotting in place on many of the basin's rivers. And so the risk for ice jam flooding is greatly reduced for much of the basin. However, wherever there is ice, and we still do have some rivers with ice, as long as there's ice in the river, then there's risk for jam flooding still yet. To summarize then, spring flood risk within the Missouri Basin varies from being near normal to being below normal, and minor to moderate flooding is expected in the lower basin. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Becky at the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Kevin. Due to our climatological risk of river flooding being driven by springtime convective rain events, the long-range river flooding risk in ABRFC's area is normal. We currently have some slightly wet conditions in parts of the Arkansas and Red River basins, but this does not translate to an increase in flooding risk throughout the spring season. This spring, we're expecting to see some minor flooding in some isolated locations, including the Neosho and Poteau rivers in Oklahoma and Slate Creek in Kansas. Now, taking a look at our snowpack, as a overall basin average, the Arkansas and Red River Basin headwaters together are sitting right about normal. However, if you look at the subbasins, the snow water equivalent is highly variable. The snow water equivalent in the headwaters of the Arkansas River's northern subbasins currently range from about 80% for the Huerfano subbasin to about 200% for the upper Arkansas and Fountain Creek basins. Further south, the snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Canadian and Cimarron rivers are sitting respectively at 92 and 119% of normal. And the snow water equivalent for the headwaters of the Mora River, a tributary to the Red River, is also at 109% of normal. And a quick word about our reservoir systems. The reservoirs in the Arkansas River Basin system have about 99% of their total flood storage capacity available, and the Red River Basin reservoirs have about 95% of their flood control storage available. So both basins are in great condition to hold back any potential spring floodwaters. Now I'll turn it over to David Welch with the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center to talk about their area.
Thank you, Becky. Well, the spring flood outlook in our area, at least on the Mississippi River, is really dependent upon the flows from our upstream offices in the Ohio, North Central, and Missouri basins. And the largest volume of that comes from the Ohio, but we do get significant contributions that come from the Missouri and the upper Mississippi from snowmelt. And without, that snowmelt, we're looking at an average to below average flood season or outlook on the lower Mississippi River. Some of the tributaries that we have may experience normal type of flooding, but those tributaries don't influence the Mississippi River on the lower end. And as far as the flooding that we would anticipate, it would be event-based or be dependent upon rainfall. And again, without the rainfall, it just depends on whether we get a large enough rainfall event that sets up upstream of us that would cause flooding. Okay, next slide. And this is another look at what we're seeing at Cairo on the lower Ohio near the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. And this is showing climatology, the historical climatology in blue relative to the conditional, which is run off the current soil moisture in model states. And it is also indicating a below normal outlook for flooding for Cairo, which basically affects everything downstream of there. Next slide. And then in with the hydrologic ensemble forecast system that's using 16 days of forecast rainfall from the global ensemble forecast system of the GEFS model, we're also in the near term over the next month not really picking up on anything significant over the next 28 days. The routing times are such on the Mississippi River that, with 16 days of rainfall plus the travel times on the river, that generally we can kind of get a decent picture out to a month for Cairo, and those points downstream. But right now we're not picking up on anything that's significant. And I believe that's all I have. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Joe.
All right, thank you everybody for those great briefings. So just one last time in summary, the potential for spring flooding across the greater Mississippi River Basin is normal to below normal this year, and that historically low snowpack across the upper Midwest and northern plains is likely to diminish the flooding potential this year, with any new flooding really across the entire basin being dependent on future rainfall events. So if you have any questions for any of today's presenters, please utilize that question box, and we'll give it just a second here and see if anything comes in. Okay, not seeing any questions coming in. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. A follow-up email will be sent with the key messages for this webinar, a link to this story map, and a PDF copy of the information covered in today's webinar. So please reach out if you have any questions. We look forward to seeing everyone over the next couple weeks and during the second spring flood outlook for the basin, which will be on Thursday, February 29th at 2:30 p.m. Central Time. So everybody have a great day and a good weekend.